Hello, everybody. Pastor Drew here with another segment of Bible Minute with Pastor Drew. We're going to continue looking at Philippians chapter 2, looking specifically at verses 12 and 13 today. Now, you'll remember we've been going through the book of Philippians, and Paul wrote this letter to a church that had been struggling with just a lack of unity, and as we'll see in some of the later chapters, with some heretics, some guys teaching some bad doctrine coming into the church. But for now, he's still sort of in this realm of thinking through unity, and he's just used Jesus and his mindset as an example for the Philippian believers. He wants them to be like Jesus. And so we just looked last time at that great hymn that Paul uses about Jesus taking up the form of a servant, even though he was in the form of God, and becoming obedient even to the point of death. And now he's going to apply this in the lives of these Philippian believers, because he uses this word, therefore, which means we need to be looking back up at what he had been talking about. And the therefore is there because Paul is trying to get these believers to continue in the path of obedience. And he's just talked about the fact that Jesus laid aside his rights and became obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. And so Paul is now saying to them, therefore, as Jesus obeyed, well, I want you guys to do that as well. And so he says, therefore, on the basis of everything that Jesus did, which can be characterized as obedience to God, even to the point of death, therefore, my beloved, the ones I love. Paul tends to use this word beloved right before he gives some serious injunctions. And that's what's happening here. He wants to remind these people, I love you, and what I'm getting ready to say comes out of my love for you. So therefore, my beloved, as you have always obeyed, so now, not only as in my presence, but much more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who works in you both to will and to work for his good pleasure. There's one command in this whole section, and it is this command here, work out your own salvation. And we're given a couple of things around it that help us understand what's going on. Paul wants us to work out our own salvation. Now this, as you can imagine, has caused a lot of consternation and misunderstanding in the history of the church. And I'm not going to gloss over that as if that's not a big deal, because this is a difficult passage. But I just want to point out a couple of things that may help us learn here that Paul is not teaching a legalistic doctrine of us earning our own salvation. First of all, he's telling these people to work out the salvation that they have. But let me point out a few other things here. First of all, notice that working out your own salvation in this passage is just the equivalent of obedience. Because Paul is drawing here a comparison. As you have always obeyed, you've always obeyed, so now, not only as in my presence, but much more my absence, work out your own salvation. So as you have always obeyed, so now work out your own salvation. I think what that does is that teaches us that what Paul means by this enigmatic phrase is the same thing as obedience. As you've always obeyed, so now obey. And I think understanding it that way kind of takes a little bit of the misunderstanding away. This is an injunction that Paul is giving them to obey. You've always obeyed, so now continue to obey. I think we can equate this with what Paul says in Romans 1 and Romans 16. The obedience that comes from faith. Work out your own salvation. And he's going back to earlier parts of the letter where he says, not only as in my presence, but much more in my absence, work out your own salvation. Just as you obeyed God and obeyed my word when I was with you, now that I'm away from you, continue to obey, continue to work out the salvation that you possess. Because even though Paul is not present, someone is present. And that's why they can continue to obey and can continue to work out growth in salvation the way that Paul wants them to do here. Even though he's absent, there's someone who is present. Who is the one who is present? God. And the thing is, in the original language, God is first in verse 13. God is the one who works in you. This actually, just in case anybody thinks that this passage teaches salvation, self-salvation by our own efforts, Paul kind of clears that up right here. The reason you can work out your own salvation is because God is at work in you. But I think here what is going on is Paul is saying, you obeyed when I was present. Now that I'm absent, continue to obey because there is someone present with you. It is God himself, and he's at work within you. And that's why Paul uses this phrase here with, well, I didn't mean to do that. This phrase here, with fear and trembling. That's a phrase used in the New Testament and in the Old Testament for the way that people responded when they saw God work. When people saw God do something in the Old Testament, they responded with fear and trembling. And what Paul is saying is, now God is working in you, and so you continue to obey with fear and trembling. Watch the work of God. And what is this work of God that they're to watch? Well, that God is at work within them so that they both will and work for his good pleasure. God is changing them. God is renewing their hearts. He's renewing their minds. He's doing what Augustine said. He's ordering their loves properly. They're being changed by God, and that work should cause fear and trembling because God is working. The God of the universe is at work within them. And on that basis, Paul says, hey guys, y'all continue to obey in my absence, just as you did in my presence. Obey, obey like Jesus obeyed, because God's at work within you. And this is what we need as believers. We need to be confident that God's at work within us. And as we see him working to change us, that needs to motivate us to continue to obey, to continue to work out the salvation that God has worked within us. And if we do that, we are going to bring God great pleasure. And so as you've always obeyed, now continue to obey and do it with fear and trembling, because that is how people responded when God worked, and God is at work within you so that you will and you work for his good pleasure. Hope this helps. God bless. Bye-bye.